At 05:45 hours on November 20th, 1943, Private First Class William Rogel stood in the well of a Higgins boat, watching the dark horizon of Betio Island grow larger. The boat rose and fell on 6-foot swells. Salt spray soaked through his dungarees. The diesel engine roared behind him, drowning out everything except the thunder of naval guns firing over his head. Rogel was 20 years old, from a small town in Nebraska. He had joined the Marines 16 months earlier, trained at Camp Pendleton, and shipped out to New Zealand. This was his first combat operation. He carried an M-one Garand rifle, 200 rounds of ammunition, 3 grenades, a full canteen, and a pack that weighed 40 pounds. With all his gear, he weighed over 200 pounds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The water ahead was wrong. Rogel could see it even in the pre-dawn darkness. The boats in front of him were slowing down. Some had stopped completely, their ramps still up, Marines still inside. Other Marines were climbing out over the sides, dropping into water that came up to their chests. They were 500 yards from the beach, 500 yards of open water, 500 yards of coral reef where the landing craft had grounded because the tide was too low. 500 yards they would have to wade through while Japanese machine guns fired at them from concrete bunkers that naval bombardment had barely scratched. Rogel's boat hit the reef with a grinding crunch. The coxswain tried to push forward. The engine whined. The boat did not move. The ramp dropped. The Marine in front of Rogel stepped forward and disappeared in a spray of red. A machine gun burst had caught him in the chest. His body fell into the water. Rogel had 3 seconds to decide. Stay in the boat and die when a Japanese artillery shell found it, or go into the water and try to make it to the beach. He went over the side. The water closed over his head. He pushed up, gasping, and started wading toward the beach. That was when he understood what hell looked like. The strategic situation in the Central Pacific in November 1943 was simple. The United States needed to advance across the Pacific Ocean toward Japan. The direct route lay through the Gilbert Islands, then the Marshall Islands, then the Marianas. Each island group brought American bombers closer to the Japanese home islands. The Gilbert Islands were the first step. They were a scattered collection of coral atolls in the Central Pacific, roughly halfway between Hawaii and the Solomon Islands. Most were uninhabited, just rings of coral surrounding turquoise lagoons. But one atoll mattered more than all the others combined: Tarawa. Tarawa Atoll consisted of multiple islands, but only one had strategic value: Betio Island, a tiny piece of coral land shaped like a bird, barely 2 miles long and half a mile wide at its widest point. It was so small you could walk across it in 20 minutes. It was so flat that the highest point was 10 feet above sea level. But Betio had an airfield. That airfield could support Japanese bombers striking American positions in the Solomon Islands. It could support fighters intercepting American bombers attacking the Marshall Islands. Control of that airfield meant control of the Central Pacific. The Japanese knew this, and they had turned Betio into a fortress. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki commanded the Japanese garrison on Betio. He was 51 years old, a career naval officer who had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1913. He had commanded destroyers in World War I, studied naval tactics in the 1920s, and commanded cruisers in China in the 1930s. He was experienced, intelligent, and absolutely douce-dote, confident. He had good reason for confidence. His 4,500 Japanese naval troops were the best the Empire had to offer. They were Special Naval Landing Forces, the Japanese equivalent of Marines. They were trained for amphibious operations and defensive combat. They were disciplined, experienced, and fanatically loyal. But Shibasaki's greatest asset was not his troops. It was his defenses. He had spent nearly a year fortifying Betio Island, turning every square yard into a killing zone. He had started with the obvious: coast defense guns positioned to cover every approach, anti-aircraft guns to shoot down American planes, artillery to bombard landing craft before they reached the beach. Then he had built bunkers, hundreds of bunkers. They were not simple dugouts or sandbag positions, they were engineering marvels. The walls were made of coconut logs laid horizontally, stacked 8 feet thick. Coconut wood is incredibly dense, almost as hard as concrete. Between the concrete layers of logs, the Japanese had poured sand and concrete, creating composite walls that could absorb incredible punishment. The roofs were even stronger. Steel beams salvaged from ships supported layers of coconut logs covered with 3 feet of sand. A naval bombardment shell could hit a bunker directly, and the structure would survive. The explosion would blow sand everywhere, but the bunker itself would remain intact. Inside, the Japanese troops would be shaken but unhurt, ready to fight. Each bunker had firing slits positioned to cover the beach and the water approaches. The slits were narrow, making them almost impossible to hit from offshore. But from inside, Japanese machine gunners had perfect fields of fire. The bunkers were connected by trenches, so defenders could move between positions without exposing themselves to American fire. Shibasaki had positioned the bunkers in depth. The first line was right at the water's edge, hidden behind a seawall made of coconut logs. The second line was 50 yards inland. The third line was another 50 yards back. Even if Americans breached the first line, they would have to fight through 2 more lines of bunkers, each one covering the next. Behind the bunkers, Shibasaki had positioned his artillery, 8-inch naval guns taken from damaged warships and mounted in concrete emplacements. These guns could sink destroyers. They would obliterate landing craft. 75mm mountain guns positioned to fire down the length of the beach. Anti-aircraft guns depressed to fire horizontally at landing craft. The entire southern shore of Betio, where the Americans would have to land, was one continuous killing zone. 3,000 yards of beach, every inch covered by interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Every yard registered by artillery. Every approach swept by naval guns. Shibasaki had calculated that American casualties would be catastrophic. He believed he could hold Betio indefinitely. In August 1943, he had gathered his officers and told them something that would become famous. 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. He believed it. They had seen the defences. They had participated in training exercises where they had practiced repelling amphibious assaults. Every exercise had ended the same way, with the attackers destroyed in the water before they reached the beach. The Japanese were so confident they invited Korean labourers to watch from observation posts during the battle. Nearly 2,000 Korean workers had been brought to Betio to construct the defences. When the Americans attacked, many Koreans climbed into bunkers to observe what they expected would be a one-sided slaughter. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the American Fifth Fleet. He was 57 years old, a quiet, thoughtful officer who preferred chess to poker and walking to parties. He was the opposite of the stereotypical aggressive naval commander. He was cautious, methodical, and absolutely brilliant at logistics and planning. Spruance understood that Tarawa would be difficult. Intelligence reports described the Japanese defences. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed bunkers and gun emplacements. The Marines would face the most heavily defended small island in the Pacific. But Spruance believed American firepower could overcome Japanese fortifications. The plan was simple: Massive naval bombardment would destroy Japanese defenses before the Marines landed. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers would bombard Betio for hours, pulverizing bunkers and killing defenders. Carrier aircraft would bomb and strafe anything that survived the naval guns. By the time Marines hit the beach, Japanese resistance would be minimal. The 2nd Marine Division drew the assignment. Major General Julian Smith commanded the division. He was 56 years old, a Marylander who had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1909. He had served in France during World War I, in Nicaragua in the 1920s, and had studied amphibious warfare for years. Smith was worried about the landing. He had studied the intelligence reports. He had examined aerial photographs. He had noted something troubling. Betio was surrounded by a coral reef. Most of the reef was 3 to 4 feet below the surface at high tide. At low tide, parts of the reef were exposed. The Marines planned to use Higgins boats for the assault. These landing craft had a draft of 3 feet forward and 4 feet aft. They needed at least 4 feet of water to operate. If the tide was low, they would ground on the reef hundreds of yards from shore. Marines would have to wade through chest-deep water under fire. Smith raised this concern with Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who commanded the amphibious forces. Turner consulted with experts. Some said the tides would be adequate, others were not sure. The tidal patterns around Betio were unpredictable. There were neap tides that occurred a few days each month, when tidal variation was minimal. November 20th might be a neap tide day, or it might not be. No one knew for certain. Turner decided to proceed. The bombardment would be so devastating that Japanese resistance would be negligible. Even if Marines had to wade ashore, they would face little opposition. Smith remained unconvinced, but he followed orders. The 2nd Marine Division included one innovation that might help. The Marines had 75 new vehicles, called Landing Vehicle, tracked Mark II, abbreviated as LVT-2. Marines called them Amtraks or alligators. They were amphibious tractors that could float in water and drive on land. Crucially, they could cross the reef. The LVT-2s had been designed to carry supplies, not assault troops. They had no armor and no mounted weapons. They were just tracked boxes that could swim, but they could cross the reef and deliver Marines directly to the beach. LVT-2s. He was told none were available. 75 would have to be enough for the first wave. On November 20th, 1943, before dawn, 3 American battleships, 4 cruisers, and 9 destroyers opened fire on Betio Island. The bombardment was supposed to last 3 hours. It lasted 2 hours and 30 minutes because the landing schedule was running late. Thousands of shells slammed into the tiny island. 16-inch shells from the battleships created explosions that could be seen from 20 miles away. 8-inch shells from the cruisers walked back and forth across the beach. 5-inch shells from the destroyers targeted specific bunkers. The island disappeared behind a wall of smoke and flame. Observers on the ships thought nothing could survive that bombardment. They were wrong. The coconut log bunkers absorbed the punishment. Shells hit them and exploded, blowing away sand and splintering a few logs. But the structures held. Inside, Japanese troops waited. Some bunkers took direct hits from 16-inch shells and collapsed. Most did not. At 05:30 hours, carrier aircraft joined the bombardment. Dauntless dive bombers screamed down on Betio, releasing 500-pound bombs. Avenger torpedo bombers dropped their payloads on the airfield. Hellcat fighters strafed the beaches with 50-caliber machine guns. The island was invisible beneath the explosions. At 08:54 hours, the bombardment stopped. Silence fell across Betio, broken only by the crackling of fires and the crash of collapsing palm trees. Then the first wave of Marines started toward the beach. 3 assault battalions, riding in the 75 LVT-2s. Each vehicle carried 18 to 25 Marines. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The vehicles crawled across the lagoon at 4 miles per hour. Targets. Japanese gunners who had survived the bombardment climbed out of their bunkers, manned their weapons, and opened fire. Artillery shells began exploding among the approaching vehicles. 40mm anti-aircraft guns, firing horizontally, tore into the thin-skinned LVT-2s. Marines died before they reached the beach. Vehicles were hit and stopped, dead in the water. Others made it to the beach and unloaded their Marines, then turned to go back for the second wave. Japanese gunners targeted them on the return trip. Many were destroyed. The Marines on the beach found themselves pinned down by machine gun fire from bunkers that were supposed to have been destroyed. The second wave had no LVT-2s. They rode in Higgins boats. 3 waves of Higgins boats, each carrying 36 Marines. They approached the reef at 09:10 hours. The coxswains pushed forward, trying to cross the shallow water. The boats grounded on coral, 500 yards from shore. Ramps dropped. Marines stepped into water that was chest deep. Machine gun fire ripped into them immediately. Some men were killed before they got completely out of their boats. Others made it a few yards before being hit. Bodies floated face down in the red-stained water. The Marines who survived kept moving. There was no choice. Behind them was open water. Ahead was the beach, where at least there was some cover behind the seawall. They waded forward, holding their rifles above their heads. The water grew shallower as they approached the beach, but the fire grew heavier. Japanese machine gunners in the bunkers had perfect targets. Marines wading through waist-deep water cannot run, cannot take cover, cannot do anything except keep moving forward and hope the bullets miss. The gunners did not miss often. Bodies piled up on the reef. Blood stained the water brown-red. Private First Class William Rogel made it 50 yards before the Marine next to him was hit. The man spun and fell face down. Rogel kept moving. 100 yards. The water was waist-deep now. He could hear bullets snapping past his head, could hear the deeper boom of artillery shells exploding behind him. 150 yards. The Marine in front of him went down. Rogel did not stop. 200 yards. His legs felt like lead. The water pulled at him with every step. His pack weighed twice what it had in the boat. He wanted to drop it, but knew he would need everything in it if he made it to the beach. 250 yards. A machine gun burst kicked up water 6 inches from his face. He flinched but kept moving. 300 yards. He passed a Marine sitting in the water, blood spreading from a wound in his stomach. The man looked up at Rogel with pleading eyes. Rogel kept moving. There was nothing he could do. 350 yards. The water was knee-deep. He could move faster now, but the beach was still 150 yards away, and the seawall looked impossibly far. 400 yards. Another burst of machine gun fire. The Marine to his right fell. Rogel did not know his name. 450 yards. The water was ankle-deep now. He could run. He ran. 50 yards to the seawall. Japanese gunners tracked him. Bullets kicked up sand around his feet. He ran harder than he had ever run in his life. 25 yards. Almost there. A shell exploded 10 yards to his left. The concussion knocked him down. He got up, ears ringing, vision blurred. 10 yards. 5 yards. He dove over the seawall and landed in a pile of Marines who had made it. He was alive. He looked back at the water. Marines floated face down, their packs keeping them from sinking completely. Others moved slowly through the water, still trying to reach the beach. Machine gun fire continued to rake the reef. Artillery shells continued to explode among the struggling men. The first 6 hours of the Battle of Tarawa were the bloodiest in Marine Corps history. Over 1,500 Marines were casualties, most of them in the water before they reached the beach. The bodies told the story. They clustered on the reef in the patterns of machine gun fire, lay in rows where artillery had caught groups together, floated in the lagoon where they had been hit and drowned. The Marines who made it to the beach found themselves pinned against the seawall. The wall was made of coconut logs, about 3 feet high. It provided cover from machine guns firing horizontally, but artillery could drop shells directly behind it. The Marines huddled there, trying to organize, trying to figure out what to do next. Colonel David Shoup commanded the assault. He was 38 years old, from Indiana, a career Marine officer who had taught at the Naval Academy. He had landed with the second wave, waded through the fire, and set up a command post behind the seawall. He had a radio operator next to him, maintaining contact with headquarters on the ship offshore. Shoup assessed the situation. His 3 assault battalions were scattered along the beach. Some companies had 50% casualties, some had more. The battalion that landed at Red Beach 3, the western end of the island, was virtually destroyed. Only a handful of men made it ashore. The rest were killed on the reef. The Marines needed to get off the beach. The seawall provided minimal cover. Japanese snipers in palm trees picked off anyone who moved. Artillery fire continued to pound the beach. The only way forward was to attack the bunkers. But attacking required exposing yourself to machine gun fire that had already killed hundreds. Engineers moved forward with Bangalore torpedoes, long pipes filled with explosives designed to blow gaps in obstacles. They pushed the torpedoes under the seawall and detonated them. The explosions created small openings. Marines poured through, firing as they moved. The fighting became intimate and brutal. Marines ran from crater to crater, using shell holes for cover. They threw grenades into bunker firing slits. They fired rifles and automatic weapons at anything that moved. Japanese soldiers emerged from bunkers to counterattack. Marines shot them down. Some Marines carried flamethrowers, terrible weapons that sprayed burning fuel. They advanced on bunkers, fired streams of flame through the firing slits. The bunkers filled with fire and smoke. Japanese soldiers inside died by fire or suffocation. It was horrible. It was necessary. The Japanese fought back with equal ferocity. They had orders to die in place. Retreat was not permitted. Surrender was unthinkable. They fired their weapons until they ran out of ammunition, then charged with bayonets and swords. Marines shot them down, but more came. By noon on November 20th, the Marines held a beachhead 500 yards wide and 50 yards deep. 500 yards by 50 yards, on an island 2 miles long. They were surrounded on 3 sides by Japanese defenders who outnumbered them. Behind them was the beach and the reef and the water full of dead Marines. Ammunition was running low. Water was scarce. Medical supplies were inadequate. Casualties were overwhelming. Dead Marines lay everywhere. Wounded Marines lay against the seawall, waiting for corpsmen who could not reach them because they were treating other wounded Marines. Colonel Shoup sent a message to headquarters. Situation: we are winning. It was not exactly true, but it was not exactly false either. The Marines had a foothold. They were not pushed back into the sea. Japanese defenders had not counterattacked to drive them off the beach. As long as Marines held ground on Betio, they were winning. Even if it did not look like it. Even if it felt like losing. Throughout the afternoon and evening of November 20th, more Marines landed. The tide finally rose, allowing Higgins boats to cross the reef. Reinforcements poured ashore. Supplies came with them: ammunition, water, plasma, medical, supplies. The Marines expanded their beachhead, pushing inland 50 yards, then 100 yards. The fighting continued through the night. Japanese forces launched counterattacks at midnight, charging the Marine positions with bayonets and grenades. Marines fought them off with rifles and machine guns. The darkness was filled with tracer fire, explosions, screams in Japanese and English. Dawn on November 21st revealed a battlefield covered with bodies. Japanese dead lay in piles where Marine machine guns had caught them in the open. More Marines had been killed during the night attacks. But the perimeter had held. The Marines still controlled their narrow strip of Betio. On day 2, the Marines pushed inland. It was slow, grinding work. Every bunker had to be assaulted individually. Engineers would blow a hole in the wall with explosives. Marines would throw in grenades. Flamethrower teams would spray burning fuel inside. Then Marines would storm in to clear any remaining defenders. Some bunkers were connected to other bunkers by tunnels. Marines would clear one bunker, only to have Japanese soldiers reappear behind them from another entrance. The Marines learned to blow all the entrances, seal the bunkers completely, entombing the defenders inside. The Japanese fought for every yard. They had no artillery support left. American counter-battery fire had destroyed most of their guns. But they had thousands of rifles, hundreds of machine guns, and fanatical determination. They sold their lives as expensively as possible. Tank support helped the Marines. Medium tanks had landed on November 20th and 21st. They drove along the beaches, firing their 75mm guns into bunker apertures at point-blank range. The high-explosive shells killed everyone inside. But tanks were vulnerable to Japanese anti-tank guns. Several were destroyed. The rest advanced cautiously. By the end of November 21st, the Marines controlled roughly half of Betio. The southern half was still contested. The airfield was secured, but Japanese defenders held positions north of the runway. Fighting would continue for another day at least. November 22nd saw the Marines complete their conquest of the southern half of Betio. The Japanese were compressed into an ever smaller perimeter on the northern tip of the island. They had nowhere to retreat. The ocean was behind them. Marines were in front. Some Japanese soldiers tried to swim to other islands in the atoll. Marines shot them in the water. It was brutal, but there was no other choice. Allowing them to escape would mean fighting them again later. Others prepared for final banzai charges, gathering their remaining strength for suicidal attacks against Marine positions. At 0400 hours on November 23rd, the remaining Japanese forces launched their final attack. Approximately 300 men charged the Marine lines. They screamed battle cries, fired rifles, threw grenades. Marines met them with overwhelming firepower. Machine guns, rifles, mortars, artillery. The attack was slaughtered in minutes. By 0800 hours on November 23rd, organized Japanese resistance had ended. Small groups of defenders held out in isolated bunkers, but they were hunted down and killed during the day. By evening, Betio Island was secure. The battle had lasted 76 hours. The cost was staggering. 1,009 Japanese defenders were killed. Perhaps 100 were captured, most of them Korean laborers who surrendered when given the opportunity. Japanese casualties were 99%. Virtually every Japanese soldier on Betio died fighting. American casualties were equally shocking. 1,009 Marines and sailors were killed. Over 2,100 were wounded. In 76 hours, the 2nd Marine Division suffered more casualties than the Marine Corps had suffered in its entire previous history. Some battalions lost 70% of their strength. The American public was horrified when photographs from Tarawa reached newspapers and magazines. Images of dead Marines floating in the lagoon, bodies piled on the beach. The overwhelming devastation shocked a nation that had not seen such carnage in the Pacific War. Time magazine published photographs of dead Marines sprawled on the beach under the headline, "Tarawa." Congress demanded explanations. Why had casualties been so high? Why had intelligence underestimated Japanese defenses? Why had the assault gone forward when the tide was uncertain? Military leadership defended the operation, pointing out that Tarawa had been taken and the strategic objective achieved. But the questions persisted. Admiral Shibasaki's boast that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years had been proven wrong. 8,000 Marines had taken Betio Island in 76 hours. But the cost validated his confidence in the defenses. The Japanese fortress had extracted a terrible price for every yard of coral sand. The lessons learned at Tarawa changed how the United States conducted amphibious operations for the rest of the war. Navy planners realized that pre-landing bombardment needed to last longer and be more thorough. At Tarawa, the bombardment had lasted less than 3 hours. At subsequent operations, bombardments would last days. The Marines learned that LVT-2s were essential for crossing reefs. Production was ramped up. At Tarawa, the Marines had 75 LVT-2s. At Saipan, 7 months later, they would have over 700. New versions were developed with armor and mounted machine guns, transforming supply vehicles into assault vehicles. Underwater demolition teams were created to scout beaches before assaults, identifying obstacles and mapping reefs. At Tarawa, the Marines had gone in blind, relying on outdated charts and guesswork about tides. After Tarawa, no amphibious assault would proceed without detailed reconnaissance. Naval gunfire support procedures were revised. At Tarawa, the ships had fired for maximum effect, saturating the target area with shells. After Tarawa, fire support became more precise, with forward observers directing fire onto specific targets. The goal was not just to bombard the island, but to destroy every single defensive position. The development of napalm bombs accelerated after Tarawa. Aircraft had dropped standard high-explosive bombs on Betio with limited effect on the bunkers. Napalm would flow into bunkers and incinerate everything inside. It was tested extensively and became standard for attacking fortified positions. Colonel David Shoup received the Medal of Honor for his leadership on Betio. The citation praised his courage, his tactical skill, and his refusal to be evacuated despite being wounded. Shoup had been hit by shrapnel on November 20th, but remained in command throughout the battle. He walked the lines, constantly, directing attacks, rallying Marines, leading by example. Shoup later said that Tarawa was avoidable. With better intelligence, better planning, and more resources, casualties could have been significantly lower. He believed the lessons learned at Tarawa saved thousands of lives in later operations. Every Marine who survived Iwo Jima or Okinawa owed a debt to the Marines who died learning those lessons at Tarawa. Private First Class William Rogel survived the battle. He fought through all 3 days, participating in bunker assaults and defensive actions against Japanese counterattacks. He was wounded on November 22nd by shrapnel from a grenade. The wounds were not serious. He was evacuated to a hospital ship, treated, and returned to duty. Rogel participated in subsequent operations in the Marshall Islands and the Marianas. He was promoted to corporal, then sergeant. He survived the war and returned to Nebraska in 1946. He rarely spoke about Tarawa. When asked about it years later, he said simply that it was something that had to be done, and Marines did it. The battle transformed Betio Island. The bombardment and fighting destroyed every building, knocked down every palm tree, and left the landscape cratered and scarred. Bodies of Marines and Japanese soldiers were buried in temporary graves marked with crude crosses and markers. After the war, American remains were exhumed and repatriated. Japanese remains were left on the island. Today, Betio is part of the Republic of Kiribati, an independent nation in the Central Pacific. The population is about 15,000. The airfield built by the Japanese is still in use as Bonriki International Airport, the main airport for the nation. Modern buildings and homes cover the battleground, but traces of the battle remain. Japanese bunkers still exist, half buried in sand, their coconut log walls still intact after 80 years. Rusted tank hulls sit where they were destroyed. Artillery pieces lay overturned in the jungle. Unexploded ordnance is still discovered periodically, reminders of the violence that consumed this tiny island in November 1943. A memorial stands on the island, dedicated to all who fought there. It includes plaques listing the names of Marines who died, unit designations of the battalions that fought, and a brief description of the battle. Local residents maintain the memorial, recognizing the historical significance of what happened on their island. The strategic value of Tarawa was proven in the months after its capture. The airfield supported American bombers attacking the Marshall Islands. Fighters based at Tarawa escorted bombers on long-range missions. The island became a logistics hub for subsequent operations, with supplies and reinforcements flowing through on their way to forward positions. But the strategic value came at a price that shocked America. Tarawa was the first battle where Americans saw the true cost of the Pacific War. Previous operations had been successful with relatively light casualties. Guadalcanal had been costly, but casualties had been spread over 6 months. At Tarawa, the Marine Corps lost over 3,000 men in 76 hours. The photographs from Tarawa changed American perception of the war. Before Tarawa, the war in the Pacific seemed distant, almost abstract. After Tarawa, Americans understood that defeating Japan would require paying a terrible price. Every island would be defended like Betio. Every beach would cost hundreds or thousands of lives. Military planners understood the implications. If taking a tiny island like Betio cost 3,000 casualties, what would it cost to take Saipan, or Iwo Jima, or Okinawa? What would it cost to invade the Japanese home islands? The numbers were terrifying. Casualty projections for invading Japan ran into the hundreds of thousands, possibly millions. Those projections influenced the decision to use atomic bombs in August 1945. President Truman and his advisors looked at casualty figures from Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. They extrapolated what an invasion of Japan would cost. The atomic bomb became the alternative to landing Marines on Japanese beaches and fighting the same kind of battle they had fought at Tarawa, except on a scale 100 times larger. The Marines who fought at Tarawa never forgot it. Veterans formed associations, held reunions, shared memories. They honored their dead. They told their stories to younger generations. They wanted people to understand what had happened, why it mattered, and what it cost. The story of Tarawa reveals the nature of amphibious warfare in World War II. Attacking a fortified island requires accepting horrific casualties. There is no way around it. The defenders have every advantage. They are dug in, protected by fortifications, able to concentrate fire on predictable landing zones. The attackers are exposed, vulnerable, struggling through water or across open ground. Victory goes to the side that can endure greater suffering. The Marines at Tarawa endured catastrophic casualties and kept attacking. They watched their friends die, waded through water full of bodies, fought across a beach that was a killing ground. They did not quit. They did not retreat. They took the island because they refused to accept defeat. Admiral Shibasaki had been right about one thing. Betio was nearly impregnable. His defences were brilliantly designed. His troops were brave and disciplined. Under his leadership, they inflicted maximum casualties on the attackers. What he had failed to anticipate was American determination to take that island regardless of cost. The Japanese strategy in the Pacific was based on making American casualties so severe that the United States would negotiate a peace treaty rather than continue the war. Tarawa should have validated that strategy. The casualties were severe enough to shock America, but instead of seeking peace, America learned from Tarawa and prepared to fight better. Every amphibious operation after Tarawa was more successful with lower casualties relative to force size. The Marshall Islands were taken with fewer casualties than expected. The Marianas were costly, but not as costly as Tarawa per square mile of territory. By the time Marines landed at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, tactics had evolved significantly. The Marines who died at Tarawa made those improvements possible. Their sacrifice taught lessons that saved lives in later battles. Every technical improvement, every tactical innovation, every procedural change came from analyzing what went wrong at Tarawa and determining how to do better. On the 80th anniversary of the battle in November 2023, survivors gathered on Betio for a memorial ceremony. Only a handful of veterans remained alive, all in their late 90s. They stood before the memorial, remembering friends who never came home, honoring the sacrifice of Marines who had waded through hell because their nation asked them to. The Battle of Tarawa stands as a testament to human courage under the worst imaginable circumstances, an ordeal of fire, steel, sand, and water where survival seemed impossible, yet where duty compelled men forward. In November of 1943, United States Marines approached Betio, the tiny yet heavily fortified islet within the Tarawa Atoll, fully aware that they were about to confront one of the most fiercely defended scraps of land in the entire Pacific. The Japanese garrison, commanded by Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, had turned Betio into a fortress of concrete bunkers, intertwined trenches, and interlocking fields of fire. They believed it could not be taken in 100 years. The Marines proved them wrong in just 76 hours, but it came at a terrible cost. Landing on Tarawa was nothing short of a nightmare. Every failure of timing, tide, and luck seemed to conspire against the Marines. Due to faulty intelligence and miscalculated tides, many landing craft hit the shallow coral reef hundreds of yards offshore. Amphibious tractors Amtraks could crawl over it, but standard Higgins boats could not. With no choice, Marines disembarked under a storm of machine gun fire, mortar bursts, and artillery shells. Fully loaded with packs, rifles, and gear, they plunged into shoulder-deep water red with blood. Each step toward shore was agony, each breath a victory. Bullets snapped like angry hornets overhead, shells erupted in pillars of black sand, and bodies young men who had come from farms, cities, and small towns across America floated lifeless in the surf. And still, they moved forward. Those who reached the beach found no relief. The sands of Betio had been engineered for death. The intrusion of war had turned nature itself into a weapon. Barbed wire was concealed beneath the sand. Pillboxes were invisible until they blazed to life. Coconut log bunkers deflected bullets like stone, and every inch of ground had been sighted by enemy gunners. The Japanese defenders did not retreat. They did not surrender. They fought to the last man, and when ammunition failed, they charged with bayonets, swords, and grenades. But amid the chaos, amid the smoke and blood, the American fighting spirit endured. Small groups of Marines isolated, exhausted, and often leaderless took initiative. Corporals led where captains had fallen. Privates made decisions that shaped the battle. Men crawled forward through sand and shattered coral, tossing grenades into bunker apertures, calling artillery strikes by voice, hand signal, or sheer guts. Flamethrower teams and demolition squads became the heroes of Betio, burning through defences, clearing bunkers yard by yard. The battle became not a grand maneuver, but 1,000 personal struggles, one Marine, one bunker, one grenade at a time. By the second day, the Marines held a fragile foothold. By the third, they held the island. It had been just 76 hours, and yet it had felt like forever. When the guns fell silent, Tarawa looked like a place abandoned by life itself. Palm trees had been shredded into splinters, beaches were cratered, scorched, and strewn with debris helmets, shattered rifles, fragments of gear, and the silent forms of the fallen. The air carried the acrid smell of smoke and cordite mingled with the salt of the lagoon. But there was something deeper too, a kind of reverence, an understanding that this place, this small and desolate island, had become sacred. Tarawa was not just a battle, it was a turning point. It proved that fortified islands could be taken, but only at tremendous cost. It reshaped military strategy. It drove forward innovations in amphibious assault, naval gunfire support, and battlefield medicine. Most importantly, it forced commanders and politicians alike to see the human cost of island warfare not as numbers, but as names, as faces, as sons, brothers, and husbands. Today, Betio Island is quiet. The roar of artillery has long since faded, replaced by the laughter of children and the rustle of wind through palm leaves. The lagoon that once ran red with blood now reflects blue skies and drifting clouds. Families live in homes built atop what were once trenches and firing positions. Coconut groves have grown over shell craters. Nature has sealed the wounds of war, but memory remains. The rusted skeletons of Japanese bunkers still lie hidden in the jungle. Scattered across the reef, sometimes visible at low tide, lie the sunken shapes of landing craft that never made it to shore. Occasionally, a fragment of gear or a helmet is unearthed by rain or curious hands. The island whispers history. The lesson of Tarawa is not merely about strategy, nor is it solely about sacrifice. It is about the resilience of the human spirit. It is about the willingness of ordinary men to do extraordinary things, not for glory, not even for survival, but because it had to be done. Because the war could not be won without it. Because others were counting on them. The Battle of Tarawa reminds us that freedom has a price, and that price is not abstract. It is paid in fear, in sweat, in blood, in lives cut short on distant shores. It is paid by those who leave home and never return, and by those who return forever changed. We honor them not just by remembering their names, but by understanding their courage. We tell their story so it is never forgotten. For places like Betio are not just battlegrounds, they are memorials written in earth and sea. And the voices of those who fought there still echo, carried across the water, reminding us always that some sands will forever be sacred. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.